Good morning. I'd like to call this meeting of the Certification Advisory Committee to order. It's Tuesday, February 6, 2018. Can we have the roll call, please?
Chairwoman Peasley.
Here.
Tabo.
Here.
Betsy Farah.
Present.
Carolyn Dumler.
Here.
Janet Crow.
Here.
Jill Broussard.
Present.
Dr. Lighting.
Here.
Matt Weber. Marisol Garcia.
Here.
Dr. Horn.
Here. Present.
Dr. Corporich. And Sarah Spear.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you very much. First item is the Executive Director's report. An update on legislation regarding educator certification.
Madam Chair, members, good morning. Thank you for coming this morning. Want to give a quick update on a couple pieces of legislation that are moving through the process right now that affect educator certification. The first is Representative Carter's bill, and actually I think all the bills that we're going to be discussing are House bills, and I think most of them are Representative Carter's bills. The first is House Bill 2036, and this is one that we discussed at the January meeting, and this one has been moving through the process pretty quickly. This originally allowed substitute teachers to use the time that they're demonstrating primary teaching responsibility to use that time towards classroom teaching requirements for a standard certification. The way the bill introduced would have applied to the proficiency examination waivers as well as the practicum and capstone experiences. The bill was subsequently amended to narrow that to just the practicum or capstone experience. Right now the wording is capstone experience, but the effect will essentially be the same. Representative Carter has made pretty clear that her intent is for the board to come up with what that definition of primary teaching responsibility would be, but she's also been open to amending the bill to put some more definitions in there in statute if there are folks who would like to see that. But as it stands right now, the board would be charged with defining primary teaching responsibility, and of course that's probably something that would come to this committee. Again, that bill still has a little ways to go, and then of course we'll talk about that in more detail when it does come before this committee and the board, but something to be aware of. The two other bills that are out there, one is for foreign exchange teachers. That might sound familiar because this committee actually recommended opening up and modifying that rule to conform to statute because there were some things in rule that went above and beyond the statutory requirements. That rule is opened right now with the board and going through the process. But this legislation that Representative Carter would have would take out the limitation on how long that certificate can be renewed. Right now in statute, it can be renewed for 1 or 2 years, I believe, and her bill would strike that limitation and also change the name of the certificate from foreign exchange teacher certificate to international. There's not that many certificates for that out right now. I think there's something like 40, and based on the numbers that ADE provided, that has been increasing actually from just a handful a few years ago. But that would probably just require conforming changes in rule by the board and CAC. That one also has been moving, and again, we'll circle up when that comes time. And then finally is Representative Carter's other bill, which just recently got dropped, has not been heard in committee, and this has larger changes to some of the modifications that came down as part of Senate Bill 1042 from last year. Specifically, it requires the subject matter expert certificate holders to have a bachelor's degree. Those individuals, if they are qualifying under the work experience qualification, do not need to have a bachelor's degree. And I guess technically, if they're qualifying under the post-secondary teaching experience, they don't need a bachelor's degree either, but I don't know how that would happen in practice. So her bill would require a bachelor's degree regardless of the path that those subject matter experts want to undergo. It also changes the definition of, or at least the phrasing of alternative preparation program to a post-baccalaureate program. And it also allows the board or requires the board to issue certificates for post-baccalaureate certificates or post-baccalaureate programs. The reason that's significant is that right now the terminology that we're using is an alternative preparation program, and some of those were rules that came before this committee and went before the board. And we've actually been trying to work with the department on trying to come up with a more firm definition of what an alternative preparation program versus a traditional preparation program is. And this bill essentially draws a bright line that we've been struggling to try to find, and that's baccalaureate or post-baccalaureate end of day. So that'll be interesting to see where that moves. Another thing that bill does is it moves a lot of the statutes out of the board's powers and duties, which is a pretty long statute, 15203, and into a new section. Sometimes when you move statute like that, there can be unintended consequences. So that's something that I think the department and the board are just combing through to make sure that when we do transpose that section, that nothing inadvertent is happening along the way. So that's sort of a quick update on a few bills that affect educator certification. There's a couple other out there. Mr. Coleman has a bill for, I believe it's modifying some of those reading phonics requirements. That one has yet to get a hearing, but again, we'll circle up on that if and when it does come up. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions on that, or we can move on.
Yes, I have a question about the subject matter expert. Now, does that impact CTE certifications? That's
Madam Chair, members know currently the way the bill's drafted is the subject matter expert requirements are carved out separately from the CTE, and actually there's a list that includes CTE that is separate from the subject matter expert.
Thank you. Anyone else on the committee have any other questions? Well, we'll be interested to hear the passage of these bills as we go on. Thank you very much for the update. The next item on the agenda is the call to the public. This is the time for the public to comment. Members of the committee may not discuss items that are not specifically identified on the agenda. Therefore, pursuant to ARS 38431.01H, action taken as a result of public comment will be limited to directing staff to study the matter, responding to any criticism, or scheduling the matter for further consideration and decision at a later date. Do we have any calls?
Madam Chair, members, no, we do not.
Thank you. All right, well, let's move on then to item 3, presentation, discussion, and possible action regarding proposed amendments to the following. First one, R72606, regarding proficiency assessment.
Madam Chair, members, this item was brought to us by the department who identified some issues with the proficiency assessment rule and some of the corresponding references throughout the certification rules, And so they brought this item, and with those changes that are attached on 3A, there's also a PowerPoint that they put together that helps explain some of those that I think Keith is bringing up right now. I do just want to mention that when ADE brought these changes, I made some just formatting changes to the rule itself, and that's just some of the strike-throughs and colorings, but also there was some bolded language that I unbolded, and so that might have resulted in some of the line references being off from what's in their PowerPoint to what you're seeing here. So just be aware that there might be some things that they're referencing that because of my formatting changes don't line up. But with that, I'll hand it over to the department to explain.
Thank you, Catcher. Madam Chair, members of the committee, the first item we're looking at is the R72606B. And this indicates that the ATP, or the Arizona Teacher Proficiency Assessment, there were some changes with the standards back in 2011, and the rules were never updated to reflect those changes. So you can see the suggested revisions modifying to indicate the subject knowledge assessment shall assess proficiency in the professional teaching standards related to subject knowledge, and then 606 is related to the pedagogy.
Thank you. I do recall that there had been discussion in years past as the state has changed test providers and as more tests were identified and developed. We have had rule changes, recommendations because of name changes, new assessments being added. So this looks like a good cleanup.
Yeah, Madam Chair, yeah, some of the rules have not been cleaned up for a number of years, so
Right.
that's what we're proposing here. Moving on to the next one, still in proficiency assessments, 606D. Originally, there was supposed to be a performance assessment that an educator would have to pass to go from a provisional to a standard. That assessment was never developed, and there are no more provisional certificates, so that's a cleanup for this one.
And Madam Chair, members, if I may, also just as an addition to that, statute specifically limits the proficiency assessment to a subject knowledge portion and a professional knowledge portion. So not only has this performance assessment never been adopted, but the board and ADE are precluded from ever adopting anything beyond those two unless statute changes. So something else too.
And 606G indicates that a proficiency assessment shall be administered at least 6 times a year at times, places determined by the department. The testing company, Pearson is our testing company, they set the schedule for testing. So we would like to propose to update the rule to specify that the proficiency assessment shall be approved by the board since we no longer administer those exams.
Right.
606H and I describe the requirements for applicants to transfer from provisional to standard, and as we know, there are no more provisional teaching certificates. So we're proposing to just strike that rule language.
Mm-hmm.
And Madam Chair, members, something else that the department and the board have discussed when we were looking at this rule is the old subsection F, which on your handout is page 1, lines 27 through 29, which require the board to essentially set the cut scores at least every 3 years. We're reviewing that currently to see if the board has been doing that work over the past 3 years and what sort of action we need to take or if we need to relook at that. And that's something that we're working with the department on. And I think when we go in and clean up rules and sort of add additional flexibility and instead of tying ourselves down in rule, it leads to some of these rules being outdated, which is what we're seeing here. And it also leads us down roads that we didn't know were there. So just something else that we wanted to put in front of the committee as sort of a heads up as what's going on.
Okay, so Madam Chair, members, the next item we're going to discuss is just some background information, and this background information is related to the proposed changes for the special ed certificates. So the first one...
Oh, hold on a second, because I think we're going to just, let's just finish up with A first, and see if anybody has any questions about the cleanup here on this. Ketcher, is there a recommendation for action?
Madam Chair, members, yes, there is. The recommendation would be for the CAC to recommend these changes to the board to open rulemaking.
Okay, we'll entertain a motion to open rulemaking on R72606 regarding proficiency assessment to make the adjustments.
So moved.
Thank you, Jill. Second?
Second.
Second by Carolyn. Thank you very much. Any other discussion? Questions? All those in favor of this motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Aye. Okay, motion carried. Thank you very much. Okay, now we can go on.
Okay. Madam Chair, members, so we're going to give you a little bit of background information that will impact our proposed changes to the special ed certificates. So the first one is on the exams. So instead of changing the exams, or the exams right now are listed in the rule, so might be cross-categorical or mild, moderate. So we're proposing that we remove those titles of those specific exams. So if the exam does change, we don't have to open up rulemaking to change it. So it's just going to be a more generic title, like a subject knowledge or a professional knowledge exam. So if you look at the example here, we have a mild, moderate disabilities rule. So we're looking at professional knowledge, and we're looking at passing score in the special ed portion of the ATPA. And if you look at the technical area there, it establishes professional knowledge and subject knowledge. The NES special ed exam was approved by the board to meet the knowledge exam requirement. So our recommended revision would be just a passing score in the professional knowledge portion and a passing score on the subject knowledge portion.
And I'm sorry, Madam Chair, members, just to jump in before we move too far, I do want to remind the committee that they did make recommendations to the board regarding the special education rules already, and the board did open rulemaking on them. However, it's certainly within this committee's purview to issue an additional recommendation based on some of the findings that ADE had, especially when we're talking about mostly sort of cleanup and technical changes. And even if they were more substantive, that's something that this committee can recommend to the board, and they can update it if they see fit. So I just wanted to make sure that we were all aware of what's going on process-wise.
Okay, thank you.
If I could tag team a little bit here about this. So historically, the rule references the proficiency examination rule. So each certificate rule references the proficiency examination by saying we require a professional knowledge test and a subject knowledge test. Then how do we know what test for that certificate? That is put through as a consent item, and the individual test is adopted by the board. So you don't list the test specifically in the rule. You reference it as a PK, professional knowledge, or SK, subject knowledge, and then you adopt the test. What that allows for is, as test titles may change, we adopt another change. You don't have to go back and change this rule. You just adopt the test. And so it was sort of a technical error to put the test name in here rather than referring to it as a professional knowledge or subject knowledge. Additionally, we're going to clean up, and I think we're going to show you in a few slides, how the will was to have one test for mild moderate.
Right.
But we adopted, in the rule, we listed a professional knowledge and subject knowledge test. And unless we can follow this train down a little bit, there's different ways of waiving those tests, but yet it was the same test. You can waive a professional knowledge with 3 years teaching, and there are a couple other options, but basically that's it. With a subject knowledge test, 3 years teaching or a degree but it was the same test. And so we'll have a slide down where we're going to clarify that and call that just a professional knowledge test, and then we'll adopt that through consent, if that makes sense. I see more head nods, so that
Right. And I apologize if I jumped the gun, because I was thinking that these special ed changes were going to come in under all the changes with the special ed rule. So we're going to be looking to discuss changes and approving changes to special education tests, and then we're going to look at the rules separately. Is that the plan?
Madam Chair, members, it's the references to those specific tests are within the special education cert rules. And so when Bruce and Keith are referencing changing some of these specific references to the special education portion to just referencing the proficiency assessment, those are changes that we're going to have to make within the special ed rule. And so when they go through, they'll be talking about the exams and some of those references, but then there will also be more, I guess maybe more substantive changes later on to the special education certificate. So although the exam issue is sort of more broad and does touch other certificates, it also is specific to this rule.
Thank you.
Okay, next is a Secretary of State guidance. Secretary of State guidance allows board rules to go down 4 levels. And in some instances, in the special ed rule, it goes down 5 or 6 levels. So there's some conforming changes where you'll see as we go through the rule. We haven't changed any content. It's just a technical change to meet the requirements of the guidance provided by the Secretary of State. Reciprocity. So in some instances in the special ed rule, it shows that an applicant can qualify under reciprocity. However, there's a separate rule that speaks to reciprocity. So there's no need for that specific guidance or rule to be in the special ed rule, because it goes back to the reciprocity, and they would qualify under that rule already.
To give the Madam Chair members, to give the committee a specific example of that, on page 1 of the special education rule, line 27 is a reference to a valid cert from another state. And again, these are when the committee and the board adopted that larger rulemaking package and tried to clean up and move stuff around. There was a lot of changes in there, and sometimes those changes just weren't picked up. And this is one of those cases.
And you can see the example R72611K for the requirements. Roman numeral 3, valid visually impaired special ed certificate from another state. So that would already be met on the reciprocity rule. So we're just recommending or proposing that we line that out.
And for the committee's information, we've done that in the past when there have been changes to other sections of rule that govern all aspects of renewal or in reciprocity. When we open up the rule on that on a certificate, we just go through and strike all of that because we know it's covered under another rule. As we've taken out in the past years, we've removed the reference to the fingerprint clearance card. We've background checks. We've done all of that. We've taken that out as we've gone. All right, thank you. Thank you, Keith.
Madam Chair and members of the committee, next one is the course-by-course option. So you can qualify going through a teacher prep program, or you can come in and do a course-by-course. The completion of the prep program from a college or university, or the course-by-course with the completion of 2 years of teaching. So applicants who complete the board-approved teacher prep program can waive that experience with 1 year full-time teaching. However, if you are qualifying under the course-by-course, you must have 2 years of full-time teaching to waive that requirement. So if you look at the course-by-course option in R72611D3, you'll see there's some conflicting language there. So the capstone experience part of the teacher prep program, and under the option, the individuals with 2 years of teaching experience in appropriate coursework are not required to complete the teacher prep program. So you can see that the two highlighted areas up there, one has the 2 years, and then a couple sentences later, you'll see 1 year. So we're recommending that we remove the 1 year verified full-time teaching experience.
And Madam Chair, members, this is something that this 2 year and 1 year difference is something that was actually passed out of this committee and to the board as part of that larger rulemaking package. And when what's interesting actually is when Representative Carter's bill was introduced and we started looking at what the effects would be, we looked specifically at this because when we talked about substituting out the capstone experience if you're a substitute teacher, we noticed this 2 year and 1 year difference, and we had some difficulty understanding what the 1 year addition really has, because you would not be able to get that 1 year waiver unless you already had 2 years of teaching experience to get the course by course. So if the committee has any insights as to the intent behind that, or if there's other effects that maybe we're not thinking of, now would certainly be the time to help enlighten us. But otherwise it does, after meeting with the department and looking at it ourselves, it does seem contradictory.
So I'm looking for some recollection from those of us that were on the committee at the time, if that was something that we had discussed or it was some language that slipped through. Can you just give us a moment to reread and thank you. Go ahead. I do recall there was early on in this committee's experience, we had guidance and we were actually writing the rule as it went up to the board. Then we went through a period of a couple of years where we had discussions of what needed to be done, and then there was a rule writer in certification that put the information together and sent it up. And I'm thinking at that time there was a rule writer in certification. So this might have been something that was talked about, discussed, needed to be cleaned up, and passes, because I'm thinking that this is something that we would have caught. There was quite a bit of a presentation. We had several sessions of presentation on the rule. There was a lot of discussion. There was a lot of input. Carolyn?
I remember the same in that actually there was a lot of changing of language as we were discussing and talking, and then trying to see if all the changes were there without maybe it coming back to us another time to really look at it again.
Anne, do you have any thoughts?
I think you guys are right. I don't have much of a voice. But I think there was a lot of discussion, and I think you're right about someone else working through the language and cleaning it up.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much for your input. I'll try not to make any more demands on you, Anne. We appreciate you participating with us today.
No problem.
So I think that's our insight, that this is an inadvertent error.
Yes.
And
Dr. Horn?
Madam Chair, members, this reference is not just in the special education certificates, but throughout many of the other standard certificates as well. And so as we move forward, that's something that we'll look back for some more historical intent and guidance. And of course, we'll vet this as we normally do through the process to make sure that we're not missing something. But as we move forward, this will be something that we'll continue to clean up, I guess, with the other rules too. And so I think later in this agenda, actually, you'll see something similar with the middle grade certificate, this similar change.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Horn?
I probably should know this, but can you tell me the difference between C on page 1 and D on page 2?
Madam Chair, Dr. Horn, I think those are that's the new language for subsection D on page 2, the new language for applications received beginning on August 1, 2018, and then the subsection C on page 1 are the older certs. So we did that, again, that new language addition are things that we also did with the other certificates, where we had a sort of new language for applications received August 2018 moving forward compared to the existing language for certificates received up to that point.
Shouldn't the dates be back in then to specify the difference between the two? Because if you're just looking at it, it looks like they're the same. There's some differences I'd like to ask about.
It is.
Remember we moved the crosscat stuff to the end, so it's still listed. The crosscat information was moved to the end of the rule, so it's still there, but we don't have the date listed anymore. But all that information is at the end of the rule.
The cross-categorical certificate, there are no new certificates that are issued. However, it was determined that that certificate is eligible for continued renewal. Right. So that language remains.
It's actually letter O.
Yeah.
And the date is still there, December 15 or December 31st, 2015.
Can I ask another question?
Yes, go ahead. Give.
On page 3, line 8, the statement about the 1 year is also there. Would that have been struck, or do you leave that in?
Page 3, line 8.
Madam Chair, Dr. Horn, that is part of the teacher prep program. And so the 1 year of capstone experience can still be waived, or the capstone experience can still be waived with 1 year of verified teaching experience through the EPP. The contradictory language that we were seeing was in the course by course option, which applicants can take in lieu of the EPP. So
I get it.
that language is still correct because it's part of the EPP option. And that the course by course option with the 2 years of verified teaching experience, the rule does reference the entire EPP requirement, which includes the capstone experience, which is another reason why we think that 2 year and 1 year is contradictory, because it already encapsulates it in the reference.
Anybody else have any questions as we're going through? I know I looked at that. I had to read that several times to figure out that that's what we were doing. It was the EPP, and it also covered then the course-by-course option, which was quite a bit different.
Thank you.
Okay. So far, so good.
All right. So I'll be your guide as we. So the format of the presentation is to take those overarching things we talked about with the exam, kind of technical correction, the reciprocity, and the course by course, and then highlight those as we go. There's a few other odds and ends, and I'll point those out along the way. So on page 1, I think we're good with, I think 12 and 13 are the new lines. It's striking the obsolete language referring to the crosscat. If we go down to line 16, we're striking that as kind of a remnant that should have been struck earlier. It no longer applies. Down to line 27 is that reciprocity concept. It's already, I think, in 607 or another rule that overarches all certificates. The 28, so line 28 on down is an attempt to fix the outlining. And so that some of that gets moved down the road a little bit. Over on page 2, and you'll see all the lines struck on letters on line 4 through 12 as well. Those are moved up and just listed with commas rather than going down another level. If we go down to around line 17, that fixes the exam reference, as well as, and then the next change is on page 3. Line 13, that fixes that exam reference as well. And then lines 15 through 18 is struck as we're requiring the same exam for both PK and SK, by confusing the issue of how folks waive it. And so if we're going to go with one test, the suggestion is to make it the professional knowledge test and strike the subject knowledge test.
Madam Chair, Bruce, Mr. Duplanty. I remember we talked about this, and this is because we went with one test for this cert. Is that right? So that test is still getting waived. It's not like we're taking out the ability to waive an assessment. It's just that because it's one assessment, we don't need to reference, and it's actually confusing if we reference the two. Is that?
It has both a professional knowledge and a subject knowledge, which applies different forms of waiving. And so I think we in earlier meetings, it was discussed to not do the subject knowledge in elementary for the certificate anymore, was to in fact just leave it with the I think the cross-CAT test is adopted, but for the mild moderate certificate, and to call that, we need to call it one. We need to call it, and so if we call it a professional knowledge, then you can apply the professional knowledge waivers.
And there was a time that we needed the elementary test because the alternate assessments for students were based on elementary standards. But now with the new move, the alternate assessments are all based on grade level standards. So there's not a need for special education teachers at different grade levels to be knowledgeable of elementary curriculum, especially since we have so many in teachers in the high school programs. It was no longer helpful. Okay, thank you.
Going on, the last one on this slide on page 3, it's actually end of line 25, 26, and 27 is to fix the 1 year, 2 year reference in the course by course. Mm-hmm. The next change suggested, so this was that whole discussion on the paraprofessional experience. Mm-hmm. And we researched the comments and tried to recall the conversation. And so some technical cleanup there. We discussed that it probably bears the burden on the EPP to really weigh whether the person has whether they'll be able to provide that opportunity in their elementary practicum capstone experience to have those opportunities, it would be difficult for somebody to come in and verify that with us, that really should be verified by the EPP. Mm-hmm. So it kind of moves that along that way, which actually it makes it easier for the applicant coming. We just envision the applicant coming with that institutional recommendation at the end, applying for certification and being done, because the education program provider, the program, has verified what they needed to verify in accordance with the rule. Makes sense. And then the next line, and I'm not sure 31 through 35 is correct. I'm trying to read through. The next change just clarifies the expectation of when they're to have that paraprofessional experience. I'm trying to find that line. So it's line 36 and 37. Yeah, so 2 years preceding the application could be problematic. It should be right before the capstone experience.
And you have that on line 35 and 36. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
For the 2 years preceding commencement of the capstone experience. Now, so can you clarify for me that what is the function of lines 33 through 37? The verification of working as a paraprofessional is in lieu of what? It's not in lieu of the capstone experience. It says for the 2 years preceding commencement of the capstone experience.
So this was part of that, the rule that if we had a paraprofessional that had done, I think the evaluation is part of this as well, had set this up with the program provider, had those experiences, was doing the program, then they could, instead of stopping work, they could go on the student teaching intern certificate for their elementary practicum, continue to be paid, have those experiences that are detailed just after this.
Right.
But when we're looking back at when the paraprofessional experience was, we need to make that verifiable and make sense. And so prior to the application could be problematic, but prior to the capstone experience makes sense, because they're leaving. They're not going to be a paraprofessional anymore while they're on the student teaching intern for that elementary part of the practicum. The EPP has to help, and the school they're at have to help provide the things that are on the top of page 4, and then they're waiving or meeting the expectation for this mild moderate practicum part.
Okay.
So it's only the only portion that's being exempt is the special ed portion of the capstone. And that has to be done before they begin the general ed portion of the capstone. Am I reading that right?
And that's for dual certified.
For dual cert.
For dual certified.
Okay. That makes sense.
Does anybody else have any questions for my comments?
Well, it doesn't say that.
Oh, no, it does say that.
Does it say that?
Because the first paragraph 4.
So it starts on C on page 341. I know it's hard with all the lines and the strike-throughs. Completion of the capstone experience in elementary, middle school, or secondary education and demonstration of all of the following competencies during the dual certification educator prep program. And then it lists the team and the IEP drafting and the especially delivered instruction. So prior to applying for certification, they need to have it. I'm not sure that it could be part of the capstone, but it could also be prior.
Right. The field recommendations from school district directors of special education coordinators is still very much not in agreement with the recommendation for the paraprofessional. However, the field also recognizes that the rivers flow, the tides rise, the moon continues its cycles. So, with that, the recommendation from the field is that we add that to line 35, that the paraprofessional working with students in classrooms for mild to moderate special education students. There's a very high number of paraprofessionals, paraeducators working as one-on-one assistants in classrooms. The primary function of those positions are to attend to the individual needs of the students, and as the students experience distress, difficulties, the function of the paraprofessional is to remove the student from the classroom. So there's a tremendous amount of time that those one-on-one students, paraprofessionals, are not engaged in working in a classroom. They're working with their individual student. So the field would like to see that, and I highly recommend that, the addition of the classroom, 2 years working as a classroom instructional assistant, and realizing that will be a challenge for some individuals. If they want to go this route towards certification, they need to be working in that classroom setting. They're still not working and performing teacher responsibilities because under IDEA they cannot deliver instruction. They can only reinforce. They're only as involved in planning as their supervising teacher might allow that to happen. And there are many teachers out there that are enlightened and look at their paraprofessionals in their classrooms as partners in education. That's not necessarily the case in all circumstances. So that's the recommendation from the field, to at least add classroom experience in there. Is that something that we can do? I mean, and I'm looking to certification, and I'm looking to the board, because that's a recommendation.
I need to run it by SPED, but
Yeah.
that would be something that I need to bring in our ESS department into the loop with that as well, because I know they were here at the meeting previously, I think in October, when this was discussed. So I would just like to give them an update on that.
Dr. Broussard?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I absolutely agree with your recommendation. I think that one of the things we'll have to consider if we do add classroom experience is defining what that classroom experience is. Because if you just have a para in the room, and even if that para is taking a student out, that still may be classified by some as classroom experience. So there should be a definition of what that classroom experience is. Thank you.
Dr. Demler?
I was just going to add, I think that would be very difficult, because we typically don't hire any of our parapros as one-on-one parapros because we don't want to give the impression to the child or the teacher that this is now your person. Mm-hmm. But they are all hired as classroom parapros. That doesn't mean that often they don't serve in that capacity as a one-on-one. Right. So I think that will be very difficult. Let's just say.
And the thought is that it's verified experience as a classroom assistant. Anybody else have any other questions? Now that would be then that's a recommendation for that language change. Do we have time to do that? The rule is open. Is there time to get that feedback?
Madam Chair, members, certainly we can work with ADE and ESS, and at the very least, I think we can put some language together that we think may be workable. And what we can do is we can provide that as an update to the board at the February meeting, along with some of these other changes, if that's what CAC wishes to do. And that'll sort of put it out there. And we'll make sure to disseminate that information to the field, seeking additional feedback. But I think we can probably try to find something that's workable. If we do add in classrooms, I do want to give a credit to Executive Director Williams, who brought up the point about needing to define classrooms at the same time that Member Broussard did. So I want to make sure she gets credit for that. Because right now that the way the rule is structured is that who would need to determine what that classroom or in the classroom is would have to be the EPP, and then I assume that the CERT desk would, if they verify that, then they would just take that. So whatever we put in place in rule, we'll need to make sure we have clear expectations with the EPPs on what they're verifying. So I think that we'll have to work something up, and then we can provide it to the board and get it out to the field and start working it that way. So, Madam Chair, members, I guess if we ended up, after going through the rest of the rule, if we wanted a recommendation, we could put in something like tentatively on page 3, line 35, after education, add in classrooms with the stipulation that board staff and ADE staff is going to work on maybe massaging that language for what would go before the board. But I think there's still more of the rule, and we can talk about the recommendation if there is one after going through the rest.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. Continue on. Thank you.
Madam Chair, members, I just would like also to highlight, I neglected to do so up front. We looked at this not for substantive changes, but just as a technical cleanup. So, we don't have a horse in this race per se. It's other than making it easier for applicants to apply and efficient for us to evaluate, and that this rule makes sense. Is where our eyes were. So now we move to page 4, provisional specialized certificates and lines. I think that got moved to 10 and 11. Mm-hmm. So we're no longer issuing provisionals, and so that would be that cleanup, and we don't need to extend. Page 4, lines now 17 on down. This is old language that no longer needs to be there. Where's this? Make sure I'm on the right page here. Yep. Okay. Line 438. So now 38 is down to 41. Allow them to qualify for the standard. So this is folks with some old certificates, LD, ED, ID. Those folks that still have certificates. So it's allowing them to still renew it. But also some folks are still on provisionals. I've even ran some numbers with a handful of reciprocal provisionals hanging out there, and so this is allowing them to transfer to a standard without losing that certificate. They don't need to go to a mild moderate or a severe and profound. They can still maintain the certificate they applied for.
Right.
So this language does. All right, page 5, the severely and profoundly. So starting on 10 down, 10 would be the reciprocity fix. And then 11 down is the obsolete requirements, as well as moving them to fit, why do we say obsolete requirements, and to reduce outline. So we're taking out old language, and then we're also reducing the outlining by moving it down to 24 through 30. So around, what's the next one? The exams is on line 44, I believe. Page, so that takes care of that. Now on page 7, it's line 7 through 9 actually, is the course by course 2-year, 1-year issue. Okay. On line 24 is the reciprocity issue. Line 27 is again the exam issue. And then we jump to page 8. There's another exam issue actually on line 12, 13 in there. Line 22, we have the 2-year, 1-year issue as well. And then the visually impaired certificate. Again, we have a remnant on lines 26 and 27 to the provisional, which needs to be removed. We get down to line 40, we have reciprocity. Line 43, we have the exam issue. Next page, page 9. There's an outlining change on number 11, just a re-letter. And then in 36, 37 is the exam issue. All right, page 10. Lines 11 and 12, we have the 1-year, 2-year issue, course by course issue. And then this rule hadn't been updated for a long time, for quite a while, and it had many outdated pieces as well as it just kind of got to be a mess in the outlining. And so old language, I believe, is struck, and some of the other information, this whole section from, we have reciprocity in 23, and then 24 down actually gets moved to page 11, and it fits better in that outlining.
Madam Chair, members, I'm sorry, I think on page 10, line 6 and line 11, are those, is the subsection M reference wrong? Should that be subsection L?
Yeah, it should be.
I think so.
Yeah, I see that. Yeah.
Okay. So, Madam Chair, members, page 10, line 6, and then line 11, I think maybe when we were, not in this rule, but maybe in a previous rule when we were renumbering or relettering some of these sections, those references didn't get updated. So instead of M1B, it should be L1B. Yep. Because we're talking about that current subsection rather than the subsequent subsection, which is a totally different cert. So that's just a technical change we can make.
Good catch.
Yeah, no kidding.
Right, line 11, or page 11, 17 and 21 is a cleanup for exams. And then there's where the outlining comes back in with those requirements. And that should.
And we need to make that subsection change on line 24 on page 11.
Madam Chair, no, I think we're in a new, we're in M now. So I
Okay.
think that reference is correct now. It's just the reference from the previous subsection was wrong.
And then if we go to page 13, we have the testing cleanup on lines 1 and 3. We're fixing the reference to the subsection on line 9. 15 through 17 is the course-by-course 1-year, 2-year issue. And then from 18 down is similar language to that we discussed in the mild moderate in reference to the paraprofessional dual program.
So you would want the same change there.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me. So you would make the same change there about classroom.
Right.
Okay.
Line 20 needs a cleanup. I'm not sure why 3272 is in there, but
Right.
Oops.
and then page 13. And it
Hold
starts
on a
line
second. Did you catch that change, employee continuously as a paraprofessional working with students in an early childhood special education classroom?
Mm-hmm.
That is a proposed change. Knowing that we cannot legislate everything, at least to get that process started. And that thought process that this is what the experience is being sought. Okay, thank you.
All right. So on page 13, line 40 on down, it continues in page 14. This is where we move the crosscat. We suggest moving the crosscat language to maintain those certificates. We don't issue those anymore. We don't issue provisionals, but folks still need to maintain those through the ability to renew them and through the ability to transfer. There's no longer extendable or convertible. We're transferring. We've discussed that if there was a concern by removing the ability to extend those certificates, I went back and shared with board staff as well that there's 1,441 folks that have a provisional crosscat or reciprocal provisional crosscat certificate that need to take some action on them or let them lapse. So from the certification perspective, we see folks that apply for a certificate here and then end up not moving here. And so they don't take action on their certificate. Those reciprocal provisional certificates, there's 180 of those. That might be some of those folks. It also could be folks that have a deficiency on their certificate, and is there an issue with that? And as well as the provisional, regular provisional. We're no longer looking for the 2 years teaching. They can, if they met the requirements, they can simply transfer. If they still have a deficiency, they do need to address that. However, since August 9th, there's a myriad of ways of waiving tests, even taking out-of-state exams. And so the extension wouldn't have helped them either. And so they still need to address those. So we don't think that there's any ill effect on the field or for these folks by removing the ability to extend a provisional certificate, that they simply should transfer to the standard after taking care of maybe some deficiencies that are coming due, and they would have been due either way.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Demler, do you have a question?
Nope.
Does that take us through to the end? Go. Thank you. Thank you very much for the information. So as we go through, I've gone through this. Thank you very much for making it so clear with the slides. That was very, very helpful. Thank you. This is big and complex. And so while most of it is cleanup, the addition of the paraprofessional made it substantive change that we want to address. And my recollection as we're going through this, we're looking at two changes to this. One is to add verification of work experience as a paraprofessional in a classroom on the mild, moderate, and the early childhood certificates, and then also to make that that change on line 10, the reference, page 10, line 6, requirements in subsection, change it from M to L.
And line 11 as well.
And line 11 as well. That's right, it was on both places. On page 10. So, Ketcher, how do you recommend we do this? Do we want to have a motion to amend the recommended rule for those to change those three changes, and then vote, and then take a motion on the entire on the package?
Madam Chair, members, I think we could probably make a motion for the entire SPED rule, and if that motion fails, then we can start breaking it up and piecemealing it if need be. Or we could, I don't think we need to take a motion on those technical changes. I think those are things that we can add, but if you want to break up the parapro with the entire SPED rule changes, that's another option.
So the technical changes, we don't need to, that's technical changes, it can stand and go with the rule package.
Madam Chair, members, that's correct. Whenever we make the recommendation, a final recommendation, we can always throw in the addendum that with technical changes as specified.
Okay.
Unless, of course, committee members have issues with the technical changes that we identified that the chair highlighted just now.
Okay. Well, I'd like to have some discussion and thoughts from the committee on the how we want to proceed with the paraprofessional language.
Just talk about the entire package with the amendment to add the classroom language to paraprofessional.
Well, I'd like to have some discussion and see that this is a route that we want to consider. Thank you, Dr. Horn.
To change it to the classroom.
Right. Verified classroom experience.
Right.
Chairwoman Peasley, as long as I have assurances that the classroom experience piece is added, I'm comfortable voting on it as a package. But I would defer to our more senior members, just in your experience, is it wise to do that, or is it more prudent to break it up? But as long as there are assurances made that the classroom piece is added, I'm comfortable with that.
Right.
Yeah, I think that we need to review it to make sure
Okay.
that the intent is actually
Translated.
our intent is translated.
What's illustrated, yeah.
So are you saying you want to review it after they've had a chance to talk with ESS and bring it back to us?
Yeah, I think so.
Can I ask?
Janet?
Is it possible to see it without all the markouts? Without all the deletions? Because it gets confusing to me.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, member, do you mean with everything fully engrossed? If we were to adopt all those changes, what the rule would look like, fully engrossed? We could try to put something like that together. I mean, it's a little more labor intensive, but we can.
Well, I have a reason for that. I think there's a lot of confusion, and this way we will see it together and see if there's not a repetition or a way of crossing out the previous one.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure there's repetition in here, and I'm pretty sure that there's contradiction. So I'd like to see it without the marks.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for your recommendation. We appreciate that. Then we always run the risk at that point in time of, do we get everything substituted correctly without it being done by the actual rule writer, but that certainly can be an attempt that possibly can be made for us.
And Madam Chair, Member Crow, just for clarification, are you looking for just for the parapro or for that entire SPED rule that you'd like to see it engrossed?
I would like to see it for the entire rule.
Okay.
And the thing is, labor intensive, you can just copy and paste and delete. And we don't have to see you know what I'm saying?
Madam Chair, Member Crow, yes, I certainly understand. I think it can be, with this rule, it can be a little more labor intensive because we have to strike out in all those renumberings of the numbers. We would then have to strike out and take out the underline and the bold, and it's not necessarily intellectually challenging, but it's just kind of tedious and takes time. But if the committee was patient, we could probably do that and bring it back at the next CAC meeting, which sounds like the CAC would like to see some of that additional language on the classroom time anyways. But that's something that we could do.
Okay. So I'm wondering, we've talked about some changes, some recommendations. Are we time bound to make a recommendation on this rule prior to the next board meeting?
Okay. Madam Chair, members, no, there's no time constraints in terms of the rulemaking, but I will say that, and I think we've mentioned this before, that there are interests at the legislature in seeing something like this happen. Mm-hmm. And although I think the legislature respects that we're going through the rulemaking process and want to make sure that this is done correctly, and I think that that's something that they respect, certainly, I do just want to caution the committee from taking too much time on this without producing some sort of results in that we would potentially lose some trust with the legislature. I don't know if waiting would impact that, but that's something that I think we should keep in mind.
Mm-hmm. So, Chairwoman Peasley, that's what my worry was, is trying to, and I understand we can't legislate, but I'm curious as to the feedback. I think we could come up with some wording today to put in. When you spoke with representatives of the field, they were concerned about the one-to-one paraprofessionals. So what language can we add to it? Is it classroom paraprofessional? Wrong word, but instead of working with, maybe supporting IEP goals of multiple students. I mean, I think we could define it better rather than waiting and having a new law dictate.
Yeah, that's what we were thinking, to put verified experience working as a classroom as a working as a paraprofessional in a classroom. Coming up with some language along those lines, because that classroom experience is just so different.
Mm-hmm.
And the verification piece is on the is on the EPP. Already, the EPP has a charge to verify teaching experience. So that's not an unusual, something new, innovative task for the EPPs to do. Sure. Yeah. Member Spear?
I just wanted to sort of throw in my 2 cents with regards to what Ms. Vera was referring to. The concern that the legislature could go ahead and create additional legislation that would then dictate or veer in a different direction from what this board would like to see concerns me. I think it's a realistic situation.
Yeah. The intent from the as those of us have spoken with representatives and senators, the intent is that if someone has worked as a special education assistant, or a paraprofessional, then they have sufficient experience and knowledge to use that, translate that experience into being a teacher, which is the language that we have now.
So how much of a definition, because that's, it's verified experience working in the classroom, gaining experience specifically in the areas of?
It would be mild, moderate, or early childhood.
But not just that, what sort of actions do we need to, that are taking place in the classroom that are going to keep them in the classroom and not being pulled out one-on-one with another student, to define that aspect or piece of it?
We're talking about the work assignments for the paraprofessionals. We can't define. I don't see that we can define specific tasks, specific activities.
Yeah.
It's going to be the environment.
Okay.
It's only the environment that we could have a discussion of verified experience working as a classroom paraprofessional. And I don't even know that we can exclude the one-on-one, because there are times that those paraprofessionals get used and get pulled and go all different directions. But what's the primary assignment? And maybe that would be the language primary assignment as a classroom paraprofessional.
Madam Chair, what if you said primary assignment working with multiple students?
Or gaining experience in a classroom environment, like you said.
And in a school setting, I mean, do we need to make a distinction? I mean, I could see that just that the intent of some of these laws has, in my opinion, sort of watered down the baseline expectations that parents and voters and taxpayers have for their students. My concern would be if we say in a classroom, what classroom? Is that in, do we need to even specify, is it in a accredited charter? Is it a school district charter? Okay, that's there. Thank you. That's just, I could see it's some classroom.
It's going to go, and that's the concern from the field, that it is so open that there are no guidelines. There are no restrictions. It could be anything, anywhere. And I don't know that if this is going to be open, if this is going to be the paraprofessionals in the field, we don't want to see it that, we have to differentiate between the private day school setting, or we have to differentiate between charter schools, a classroom, in all those different environments. Because that's certainly... The issue for the field is the paraprofessional is not trained, does not have the experience. This does not, we just don't feel it is comparable to a capstone experience. But the reality is it's going to happen. And if we can at least make the recommendation that the verified experience is that the paraprofessional has the primary assignment of being assigned to a mild, moderate, or early childhood classroom for 2 years. That gets us a little closer. Dr. Horn?
Can we not add that language and then define, if we want to further define that, or if the department needs to further define that, they can bring that back at a later date? Because I think the legislators are looking at this, and if we put it off a month, they may decide to do some things that is worse. So I would suggest we find, I like your words, primary assignment. I think that helps in a classroom. So perhaps we could add that as an amendment and vote on the package.
And define the classroom, like you said, mild, moderate, or?
Yes, as mild, moderate, and there's 2 places for this language. One is in the mild, moderate certificate. The other is in the early childhood special education certificate.
Right.
Because if you notice, there's not a pathway for paraprofessionals assigned to an early childhood classroom or an elementary classroom. There's not a pathway for them to become certified teachers, and I haven't heard anything about that yet. So that's, at least not yet. Maybe I shouldn't have said anything. I spoke too soon. Dr. Dumler?
So what if you said verification that the student was employed continuously as a paraprofessional whose primary assignment was working with multiple students in a mild to moderate special education classroom.
Can you read that again?
It's in my head, but I'll try. Verification that the student was employed continuously as a paraprofessional whose primary assignment was working with multiple students in a mild to moderate special education classroom. Does that cover it?
Are multiple students 2 or 3?
Well, it could be, but I don't think we're going to. The reality is the EPP is going to go to the principal and say, tell me about the classroom, and they're going to sign off on it.
And why don't we say classroom instead of multiple students?
And Madam, we have classroom too. We have multiple students in a mild to moderate special education classroom.
Thank you. Dr. Lighting?
I have one concern about the multiple students, and that is that sometimes paraprofessionals are assigned to multiple students, like this one from 8 to 10, this student from 10 to 12. So they're still not getting that experience that we're talking about. I almost think the classroom is a little broader than stating multiple students myself. I don't know. I'm just
okay with that.
Right, and the field would be fine with that too, because even within the classroom, that's how it works. If you have a classroom, you've got several paraprofessionals, 1 or 2. They're assigned different groups of students because that's just the reality and what it looks like in special education classrooms. So I think we can leave out the multiple students and just have a primary assignment in a working in a mild to moderate classroom.
Yes. And if you say working with students, students is plural.
Plural.
Yeah.
Working with students in a mild to moderate classroom. Thank you.
Because I felt I should voice for my rural schools that have very small populations, and I'm sure it's very rare that you come across one that only has 1 student in special ed or special needs, but there's always that.
Actually, in the rural schools, we do have multiple examples of just one-on-one paraprofessionals because there are not enough sufficient students to create a class. And so we have one-on-one students, paraprofessionals working with students who are included in general ed. That just is what ends up happening there. So we could... is there any more discussion? Any more ideas? I've seen a lot of head nods. Member Garcia, you've been very quiet.
It's a lot of changes.
And Madam Chair, Member Garcia, to that point, we are not anticipating closing rulemaking at the February meeting, and so we will apply these changes and update the board at that February meeting on this rule. And then we have a subsequent March 6th CAC meeting where we can always agendize this if there's any additional concerns that come up in that time while we continue to digest this and get input from the field, then we can address those changes for a potential closing at the March meeting. So hopefully that'll allow for some more time with the recognition that we would like to get something done, especially before the end of the legislative session, but still enough time to digest it. So I think that's a good middle ground there.
I think so too, but I think we, at our committee, we do need to be cognizant that this recommendation has come forth several times. The committee's been very clear on the recommendation, and it is time to get it moved on. And I would feel very comfortable with taking this back to certification. I know the field has expressed their comfort with adding in the language for verified classroom experience. So that's a recommendation from the field as a solution to bring closure to this. And if this is something that can be also approved by Exceptional Student Services Division, that would be helpful. I'm wondering, do we also need then to create a new definition for a verified paraprofessional classroom experience?
Madam Chair, members, we do have later on the agenda talking about definitions in general. And as I mentioned, also with some of the bills going through the legislative process, this committee will have to talk about primary teaching responsibility, although that'll probably cover different certificates. That might be a time to start talking about some of these other definitions as well.
Okay. I don't want that to get lost.
Understood.
So, from the committee, is there a recommendation to send this back to certification to rework it with the recommended changes and gather the feedback?
Right. Wait, are you saying send it back to ADE, or are you saying send it on to the board?
Send it on to back to certification to and the executive director. Not move it on, not forward it to the board. A recommendation to return it for additional rework and feedback. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, I think what we had discussed was making the recommendations to the board, and then staff would update the board at the February meeting with those changes, and then at the CAC, the subsequent CAC meeting on March 6th, then we can continue to discuss if there are outstanding issues.
Okay. Sorry, I misunderstood.
And in doing so, you would add that proposed wording.
Madam Chair, Dr. Horn, that's correct.
Okay.
Yes.
So
with the primary teaching assignment
revision
in the classroom.
Okay, so I will make the motion that we recommend to the board the proposed amendments, including the change in wording around the classroom to say the student was employed continuously as a paraprofessional whose primary assignment is working with students in a mild to moderate special education classroom.
And the other one, early childhood. Or just one
Well,
at a time.
and that also be inserted in the early childhood section.
And with the other technical changes that were identified.
Absolutely.
All right, that's the motion.
Second.
Seconded by Dr. Horn. Any more discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed?
Aye.
All right, thank you very much. Motion carried.
No.
She has the delay.
Just a delay, poor thing.
So thank you very much. All right, let's go on to item 4, presentation and discussion regarding proposed amendments to R72601 regarding definitions.
Madam Chair, members, the definitions section and some of the additions there also came up during our meeting with the department. Because we were hoping for some additional information, we asked to just have this as an information-only item, and we would bring it back potentially at the March meeting if we wanted to make a recommendation to the full board. And they can talk about a couple of those additions that they are asking for. We, board staff, also added a definition on page 1, line 12 and 13 for capstone experience. And this is in light of those new certificates that are going to be coming in August reference capstone experience rather than practicum. And we don't have a definition for capstone experience for the certification rules. We do have a definition, as ADE pointed out to me after I sent this out, we do have a definition for capstone experience under the preparation program rules. And so I have that on another tab up here that I'll bring up, and that's an option rather than what I sort of mocked up here, another option. So we can talk more about the capstone experience, but for right now I'll turn it over to ADE and they can talk about their other recommendations for the definitions page. And again, this is just information only for right now.
Madam Chair, members, our first recommendation is for the term accredited training that is referred to in all of the course-by-course options, which will go into effect August 1st of 2018. It references accredited training, but it never defines what accredited training is, what we'll be looking for when an applicant brings us some training. And so just to bring back the historical piece, traditionally, we call it option B, for those of you who work with educators. Option B is, I didn't do a program, I took courses a la carte, and I probably didn't student teach. I'm using some time in the classroom. We see people come in basically off the street, having had coursework and training and going in. We see folks applying for an additional certificate. So, for instance, they were an elementary school teacher and would like to teach secondary. They typically go through the course-by-course option because they didn't have a secondary program, an elementary program. But due to their training as an elementary teacher and their experience maybe in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, they can obtain the secondary certificate. And so that's this course-by-course option. With the change that went into effect August 9th, we defined the list of topics for every certificate in terms of what the training they needed. We removed the need for a credit hour, specific credit hour. So we're now looking for coursework and training in this list of topics. And if they meet that, then they fulfill that requirement, and we go on to look for experience, practicum, and testing. So it refers to accredited training, but we don't know what to look for with that. And so this is an attempt to suggest some language. There are apparently associations that accredit trainings. Much like the board, the reason we want to do this is so that we're not constantly going to the board with, does this training work, does this training work, does this training work? The board adopts, for instance, a higher ed directory. It's a list of all the colleges and universities that are accredited or gone over, and we can accept coursework from those. So we're looking for something similar to that to hang our hat on, to go, they're accredited by this association, and so this coursework works to meet that requirement.
Mr. Duplanty, how does that impact the alternative teacher prep programs, or and perhaps the districts with grow their own teacher programs?
Madam Chair, so first, the educator prep programs, those are already board approved, so that, and by and large, that's coursework, and those folks are listed in the higher ed directory as well as the programs already approved. In terms of the district grow your own, I think that is a question, and I'm not sure if either Keith or Katcher can weigh in on that too.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, that's a question that we did have when we were discussing this earlier, which is why we're not ready to present it to the committee at this time, because we have some other discussions that we need to address before we're ready to present it.
Okay. Thank you. Dr. Demler?
I was just going to say, is my understanding correct that if there is a district grow your own program, that also has to be board approved or not?
Madam Chair, Member Dumler, the classroom base must be board approved.
Right. Katcher?
Madam Chair, members, I think one of the reasons we want some additional information is if the board did end up approving some sort of list of accredited trainers, we didn't want to get boxed in board rule in terms of what the board could or could not end up approving in terms of unintended consequences. And if there's some sort of training out there that the definition inadvertently didn't include, and then the board's stuck in a spot where they can't approve those trainers. I don't know how realistic that situation is, but that's something that just came to our mind that we wanted to make sure that we were thinking through fully. And my understanding is that if we did go down this route, ADE would present a potential list for board approval. And then if for whatever reason that ended up changing, I assume it wouldn't be regularly. Maybe at first it would be, but eventually it would be maybe every once in a while if need be.
Quarterly or biannually or something like that.
Yeah. So that's something, if there's any input from the committee, feel free to express it here or send it along to board staff as we sort of contemplate this moving forward.
Dr. Horn?
No, I was just wondering if you're going to present a list, is that something that would make a difference in our thinking about this. I don't know what's on the list. I don't know what could be on the list.
That's your other committee, right?
Madam Chair, Dr. Horn, my understanding is that the list wouldn't necessarily, as Bruce alluded to earlier, there's a directory that we reference to now, so we wouldn't necessarily have, like we do with SEI training, where we have even individual people that we approve for trainings. It wouldn't be that specific, so hopefully there would still be some flexibility and sort of an umbrella approval, but I guess we're still trying to figure out what that would look like. And I don't know if we could come up with a mock of something early, but
Sure,
I defer.
Maybe a chart. We like charts.
We'll keep that in mind.
That might help bring some clarity too as to what it could be, what it could not be. Just a thought.
Well, I could create my own organization.
Yeah, you could.
I mean, I have. I do. I have one. So, just asking.
Madam Chair, what we'll do is we'll research the associations that are out there and the criteria that they use, and bring back that research and share it with you.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other questions or comments from the committee on accredited training? Let's go to a simpler one. Approved area?
Madam Chair, members, this term has been floating around in education for a number of years, but it has never actually been defined in board rule. So this is our attempt at a definition of what an approved area actually is. So it just means a subject or content area that is taught in Arizona public schools. So if you have any guidance or suggestions, we are definitely open to hearing them.
I think it's about time. I mean, we certainly we certainly talk about that for years on this committee and hear it. It just, you're right. It's just one of those terms that we use, and it would be clarifying to have that in board rule, especially as we have people that come from out of state, and folks are using that as a term that'll help them understand that when they come here. Anybody else have any comments?
And will also give us an area to point to in board rule when we're looking at appropriately certified.
Right.
And Madam Chair, members, the definition taught in Arizona public schools is also referenced elsewhere in statute. So it's not an unprecedented wording for the definition. So it has some precedent.
And Mr. Schneider, you just brought up appropriately certified. We've asked about definitions before, and is that one of those terms that is au courant, and we don't necessarily want to put that in board rule?
Chairman Peasley, no, we do need to actually define it. There's a couple other terms that I know we're going to be working with state board staff to define, such as primary teaching position and things like that as well.
Okay. Thank you. Just as my wandering mind comes across them, I want to get that out there. All right, thank you. Any other comments on approved areas? Okay, go ahead.
Okay, and the final definition is the capstone, as Katcher alluded to earlier. It's kind of hard to read, but capstone experience means a culminating professional experience in a pre-K-12 setting. The experience may include student teaching or internships in administration, counseling, or school psychology, or alternative path pre-K-12 teaching. Thank you, Katcher. So we're considering moving, or we're proposing to move this definition to the definitions R72601, so it would encompass all programs and not just EPPs.
Gotcha. Mm-hmm. Okay. So then would you be looking to take that entire definition and dropping it in here in number 5?
Madam Chair, yes, we're looking at dropping it into number 5, where it currently says, I believe in your draft, means a culminating experience of an educator preparation program. So it's just a little bit more defined in the EPP rules, 604.
All right, thank you. Any comments, questions?
So would you say that again? You're talking about, in our packet, it just defines capstone experience. So how are you putting these two together?
Madam Chair, Dr. Horn, what's in your packet was something that I put together before ADE so deftly told me that we already had a definition of capstone experience, which I should remember from my days at the Senate in that you don't just start defining things without going through existing definitions and rules, and so I broke my own rule. So after we had sent this materials out and ADE informed me, our proposal would be, when we bring it back to the next meeting, would be we would just copy and paste what's in the EPP rule and replace what's in your packet.
Okay.
And again, this is when we talk about there's already precedent for it, so we don't need to work too hard trying to come up with a new definition when we have a working one already.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, good information.
And Madam Chair, there's one last thing on the definitions rule. The last definition, teaching experience, and that last sentence in there, substitute teaching is not considered full-time teaching experience. That is the genesis of Representative Carter's bill. That is the one sentence in rule that precludes them from counting their hours towards standard teaching certificate requirements right now. So I just wanted to make you aware of where that's coming from, and it's from that definition, which was added a few years ago, I think in 2012 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But it's my understanding that practice of not counting those substitute teaching hours goes back much farther than that. But just some additional information for the committee.
So is there going to be a recommendation to strike that or leave that in?
Madam Chair, I think that right now we would just leave it in to see what's going on with the legislation. I don't necessarily feel comfortable recommending that this committee put a stake in the ground when there's a bill that already addresses this, and we should probably just sort of wait to see what happens there, especially because the way that her bill is drafted, we would have to rework. We would have to do more than just strike that, because if it only counts towards the practicum hours, then we're going to have to start crafting some additional language to make sure we only count the practicum hours.
Right. Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. Any other comments? Okay. Be careful what you do with your hands. I might call on you. I want to be sure I'm not leaving anybody out. All right, thank you. Item number 5, presentation and discussion regarding feedback and input on the proposed amendments to R72617 regarding the guidance counselor certificate. And this is for a presentation and discussion for feedback.
Yes, Madam Chair, members, if you recall at the January meeting, we had a presentation from Kay Schreiber and ADE for changes to the guidance counselor certificate. At that meeting, it was decided that committee members would sort of go back, think about those changes, talk to their peers and their folks in the field and get any feedback, and bring it back at this meeting to discuss if there's any, what kind of feedback or input they had. And I think that she is here if there's any additional questions. And then from there we can move forward as the committee sees fit. So with that.
So anybody have any feedback? Dr. Dumler?
Sure, I'll start. So proposal 1, in terms of changing the name, I don't think there's any concern about the name change. I think that would be very well received. Proposal 2, there's a concern about recommending a specific professional development because we don't do that for any other of our certificates. And if we start to do that, there's a fear that every new thing that comes along, we're going to be asked to put that in State Board Rule 2, and that could be a never-ending discussion. So the preference would be not to include any specifics there, unless we're willing to open that door for everything else. And I see lots of head nods. Proposal 3, what's the language on the other certificates? Do they use the language of recommended or highly recommended? I think it's always recommended, right? So some of the certificates are not required, but they're recommended.
The social worker certificate is the one that we've dealt with most recently, and that decision then I believe was left up to the districts.
Right.
Yeah, Madam Chair, Member Dumler, so the social worker certificate, I think, does say something like it's optional, but may be required by local governing boards.
I think we need to be consistent with what we have on other certificates, I guess is the point that I'm making. And I didn't go back and look at some of those other ones that are not required. So what is the typical language? Optional but not required?
Madam Chair, Member Dumler, we're looking that up right now.
Okay.
I know the superintendent certificate is one of those optional certificates as well.
Right. And I think there's a few other ones.
Mm-hmm.
So I just think if we're trying to find consistency across rules, then let's be consistent.
Absolutely. Madam Chair, Member Dumler, so the social worker certificate that was adopted in December of 2016 does say the social worker certificate is optional but may be required by local governing boards. And I don't know if that's consistent. Okay.
That's the language. So for proposal 3, that just makes sense that to use that same consistent language for an optional certificate. Discussion by committee members? Marisol?
I appreciate that. I mean, the consistency, the necessity, but I just really do appreciate saying highly recommended. I wish my position would say highly recommended as well. And the superintendents would say highly recommended as well as by local governing. Because I know that now, that is something that as a mother, I definitely want to see what my local governing board has for their school counselors, because I know how essential it is for my son to feel like he has someone. But I understand that the consistency is necessary under this.
Thank you. Ms. Spear?
I think that having it say highly recommended also gives local governing boards the flexibility to make decisions based upon the best candidate available, and I think that it also addresses the disparities in applicant pool that might exist in a rural setting versus an urban setting or what have you. It gives enough flexibility within that sort of policy statement that you can navigate no matter where you sit in the state.
Right.
Which I appreciate as a governing board member.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I did hear back from some of the county superintendents, and those that are in even more rural areas than I am were concerned about the highly recommended, even though it doesn't say that it's it's not required. So, but that they really thought that could pose a problem. I personally like highly recommended. However, I think for the sake of being consistent, if we change, if we add highly recommended here, then I think we should change it in the others. But do we want to open that can of worms? But I do like the optional, but maybe required by local governing boards, because then that could leave it to that. And even in my rural district, we don't have the certified. So because we couldn't find one. So
And I serve in a district that's K-8, so we don't have guidance counselors as it is. But as a parent of 2 high schoolers, I can see where, as sort of the consumer of that, as the parent, I appreciate that level of
absolutely
professionalism that's sort of assigned to that role. But I do see that that we're sort of sitting right here, and we could be creating a snowball effect.
That's it.
But
okay, yes, go ahead. Next.
And this would be changing back to proposal 2 with the 20 clock hours of professional development. I did hear that they just in the area of college and career readiness doesn't encompass all of their duties. So that if we're going to specify, it could create the same problem that Member Dunbar mentioned, and as well as some of the superintendents voiced a concern that they would like to see professional development hours that are comparable to the teaching professional development hours, which is much greater number than this. But that was all I received.
Okay, thank you.
I
Ms. Barrett?
want to reiterate for Proposal 2 as well, the same concern about restricting the amount, because I guess for the counselor certificate, or license, not certificate, but license, they have specified hours, and what was shared with me is that the options become more narrow as you go through your years of experience and what's being offered, so it could create a burden down the road for people to find those qualified training hours. So just keeping it very general.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you very much. That's a good idea. That's right. Any other feedback?
I have a question.
Yes.
When they say 20 clock hours of professional development, is that per year or career?
That would be for each certificate renewal. And at clock,
They don't have to take 30 hours then?
Like 20 hours every 12 years.
it would be, let's Mr. Duplanty will answer that for us.
Sorry.
Madam Chairwoman, members. So the renewal requirements are covered under a different rule, R72619, and they apply to all standard certificates. And all standard certificates require 15 hours per year at the end. Mm-hmm. And so I don't believe the suggestion was to modify that the certificate only requires 20. I think it was trying to recommend that at least 20 of that by the end would be in this area. Wow. How the legislature did this the last time, if I recall, it was the human trafficking. Yeah. And how they did that is they added it to the rule. CSC and the board added it to the rule as may include. And so what they did is there's a list of trainings which may include, and there's a list. And so that might be a way to highlight the college and career readiness training by just highlighting it as an allowable training. It is already allowable, but that's how they've highlighted things in the past. It is quite a list already, but that might be a way to take it.
And where is that in board rule? Is that under the counselor certificate, the existing?
Madam Chairwoman, R72619 is the renewal requirements, and C, so 619C, I'll talk about the continuing education credit or training and list the different topics which may be included.
Okay, thank you. Just wanted to be able to look at that. So is college and career readiness currently under there, or it's not listed?
I don't see it listed, but we wouldn't preclude. I mean, we would accept that as training or professional development to allow a renewal.
So might that be a possible offering for the future to this group to say that might consideration of a possible rule change being proposed to add that? I mean, I know they're very passionate about what they do and how they feel about this. But then again, if we add that one piece, we could be talking about adding that one piece in there, but how much more else is there for counseling, for counselors? That is true. Mm-hmm. Here again, that kind of gets back to is this a college career readiness? Is this a phase we're going through? Or is this now going to be a term that we need to get used to that has now become a definite part of the Arizona education vernacular? And then in which case that would make sense to consider adding that in. Ketcher?
Madam Chair, members, I think that's a good point, and if we were to add it to this list, we could add it without the specification that it needs to be for the counselor certificate, and that means that all certificated individuals could use some sort of college and career readiness training for professional development. I don't think that would be at odds with, as you said, sort of the trend that we're going towards in the state. And a lot of ways that these items got added to this list was through legislation. So we have training regarding suicide awareness and prevention, child abuse, human trafficking of children, and the sexual abuse of children, including warning signs. A lot of those things were added. Usually what would happen is a member would introduce a bill that mandates that training, and then because that's an unfunded mandate, they would compromise and say that it would be an allowable training, and so that's why it's getting called out specifically. I think if we were to add it to this list, though, it would signal that even though we just have a list of things that it may include, it would be a signal from the board and the state that that's something that we feel is important enough to call out specifically. So that's something that the committee should consider when we talk about adding something like that. Even though it's optional, when we start making lists of optional things, we're sort of signaling that we feel it's important enough that we want to at least specifically mention that.
Right. Dr. Horn?
I agree that we need to be consistent. However, if you'll look at the second paragraph under Proposal 2, the relevant coursework and those specific items are exactly what we want the school counselor to be able to do at the high school level for our high school students. I asked a student something about post-secondary or when he graduated from high school, and he said, "Oh, my counselor doesn't do that." Well, then what does that counselor do if they're not preparing kids or giving information to kids in regard to college and career readiness? So I'm for keeping it in because I think it's important.
Okay, thank you very much for that feedback. Are there any other comments? Feedback?
Just as a note, and I appreciate your comment, Catcher, about the emphasis for the college and career readiness, and is that a signal we want to send? I believe that signal was sent pretty clearly when it became part of our A through F letter grades for our schools, and so I just wanted to say that I think that that's already been communicated to us, and I'm not sure if our adding college and career readiness on here is really going to have much of an impact.
Thank you. Any other comments from the committee? Any other requests from the department on or the board for us? Might be. Asked a question.
There was an addition for CPR.
Yes, Madam Chair, so what we're looking up right now is there is some specific professional development training requirements specific to athletic trainers and also I think maybe speech language pathologists. So we're trying to look that up now to see, actually it's not, is it athletic coaches? Is it? So the athletic coaching certificate, which I believe is optional, does require CPR and first aid certificate and completion of 15 semester hours specific to the methods of coaching, anatomy and physiology, sports psychology, et cetera, et cetera. So So I guess that the point there is that it wouldn't be wholly unprecedented for what we have currently in board rule for certain certificates. However, that certificate is optional. And then the speech language pathologist cert also has 60 credit hours required in the field of speech pathology or professional development. I think what maybe is a little bit different there, and that is for renewal though as well. So I guess it wouldn't be totally unprecedented if we had renewal requirements, PD requirements specific to the guidance counselor certificate. So that's something else for the committee to consider.
All right, thank you. So that would be considered if it comes to the committee. Thank you. Well, if there's no other further information, then item 6, future meeting dates and items for future agenda. Then our next meeting is scheduled for March 6th at 9:30.
Madam Chair, members, yes, March 6th at 9:30. Again, we have call-in options if need be. For that March meeting, we're going to, this is the list that I was using here, we're going to work with ADE on coming back with some research on the accredited training. We'll give an update on the special education rule that we'll also give an update to the board on at the February 26th board meeting. We'll look at some definitions. The definitions rule we'll bring back in addition to a definition maybe of that primary teaching for the parapros. And then we'll digest some of this feedback, and ADE and us, we can work together on the guidance counselor stuff as well. And we'll try to get the engrossed version for that SPED rule as well for ease of reading. And I think I captured as much.
Okay.
Oh, and I did just want to give a heads up. I mentioned the middle grade certificate and that contradictory language. We didn't bring that before the committee today because I wanted, with the short notice of the materials, we didn't want to overwhelm the committee with too much going on. But that contradictory 2-year, 1-year change will also be made to the middle grade cert, which was opened at the previous board meeting. So just wanted to loop you in on that as well.
Thank you very much. Dr. Demler?
I would just like to say I've been on the board for a number of years, and I just want to comment on the wonderful working relationship that I see between the department and the director's office. It's very helpful to us to see that collaboration is happening.
Yes, thank you very much. We appreciate that too. Definitely. Thank you. All right, with that, this meeting of the Certification Advisory Committee is adjourned. We'll see you next month. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, staff.